The Ukrainian attack on the Iranian cargo ship Anna in the Caspian Sea on July 25 raises a very important question. Why would Ukraine attack an Iranian vessel when Ukraine is fighting Russia? The ship's command bridge was destroyed, 1 sailor was killed, and 3 were wounded. To understand why this happened, we have to look beyond the immediate incident and examine the connection developing between Iran and Russia. The Caspian Sea has become an increasingly important corridor between the two countries. Before the war, the flow of military equipment was largely from Iran toward Russia, particularly through the supply of Shahed drones. But after months of American and Israeli attacks on Iran, that situation changed. The direction of the flow began to reverse. Russia started supplying Iran with ammunition, explosives, drone components, and critically important electronic warfare technology, including Kometa anti-jamming antennas. According to the material available, more than 20 cargo ships have been moving continuously between Russian and Iranian ports. The Caspian Sea is particularly important because it is an inland body of water controlled by Russia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan. The United States cannot simply send its navy into these waters and control what happens there. So while Washington is attacking Iran, Russia can continue supplying Iran through a route that America cannot directly control. From Ukraine's perspective, this creates a serious strategic problem. Iranian weapons have helped Russia attack Ukraine, while Russian equipment is now helping Iran resist the United States. That is why the Caspian Corridor matters. It connects 2 battlefields into one larger system. If I look at this from Ukraine's perspective, the calculation becomes much clearer. Russia is receiving Iranian drone technology, while Iran is now receiving Russian weapons and electronic warfare equipment. If Ukraine can disrupt that supply chain, it can weaken both countries at the same time. That is why the attack on Anna is important. According to the transcript, Ukraine's SBU simultaneously targeted the Iranian ship, 2 Russian cargo vessels, and a Russian naval vessel in the Caspian Sea. This was therefore not simply an isolated attack on Iran, it was an attempt to strike the infrastructure connecting the 2 conflicts. The Iranian response is equally important. Iran does not see Ukraine as the only actor involved. It sees the European countries and NATO states supporting Ukraine and Israel as part of a much larger system. An Iranian military analyst argued that the strategic response should focus on European interests rather than simply retaliating against Kyiv. The logic is straightforward. If European governments are helping sustain the war, then pressure can be directed toward the countries providing that support. We can see this broader confrontation through the cyber attacks, accusations against Britain and France, reported plans involving American military facilities in Europe, and the strike on a CIA facility in Jordan. These developments suggest that the conflict is no longer confined to the Middle East. And this is why I believe we have to stop thinking of Ukraine, Iran, and Europe as completely separate stories. The Caspian Corridor connects them, the military supply lines connect them, and once those connections become targets, the possibility of a much wider war becomes increasingly serious. What I find particularly important is that Iran's response is no longer limited to the Middle East. Iran increasingly sees Britain, France, and other European countries as participants in the war because they continue supplying weapons and political support to Israel. That is why we have seen threats against European interests, cyber operations, and reported plans involving American military facilities in Bulgaria and Cyprus. The strike on the CIA facility in Jordan is also significant because it demonstrates that Iran can reach facilities protected by American defenses. From Iran's perspective, this is a message: if Jordan is within range, then parts of Europe are also within the range of Iranian missiles and other asymmetric capabilities, and Europe appears to be taking these warnings seriously. Greece reportedly moved a Patriot air defense system to reinforce the Suda naval base shortly after the threats emerged. This is not simply rhetoric anymore. European governments are preparing for the possibility that the conflict could reach them directly. Now, I want to consider the strongest argument against my interpretation. Someone could say that all of this is coincidence. Russia sells weapons to many countries, Ukraine attacked a legitimate military target, and Iran has threatened Western countries for decades without necessarily acting on those threats. But that explanation has difficulties. Ukraine apologized to Iran after the Caspian attack, and Iran reportedly considered retaliation against Ukraine before diplomatic efforts prevented escalation. Greece then moved air defenses, and Iran began strengthening the legal framework surrounding the Caspian Sea. These developments suggest that the actors involved themselves recognize the strategic connections. And this brings us to a deeper question. Why does this war keep expanding? To understand that, we have to look beyond the battlefield and examine the financial structure behind modern warfare. That history takes us back to England in 1694 and the creation of the Bank of England. To understand why I believe the war keeps expanding, we have to look at the financial structure behind the modern state. I want to take you back to 1694, when the Bank of England was established. The bank was founded as a private institution that would act as the government's banker and help finance the war against France. What changed was the relationship between government debt and financial capital. Parliament created a system in which the state could borrow on a much more credible and organized basis. The original bank raised £1.2 million for the government, with investors receiving interest in return. That is extremely important because it created a powerful connection between finance and military power. England could mobilize enormous amounts of capital to finance wars, maintain its navy, and expand its international influence. The bank became, in the words used by historians, a major engine of the state. Over time, this model evolved. Britain eventually became the dominant global power, and later the United States inherited much of that financial and geopolitical position. After the Second World War, the dollar became the center of the international financial system, supported by institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, and NATO. But there is a deeper problem. When productive investment becomes less profitable and enormous amounts of capital accumulate, money increasingly moves into financial markets. Debt expands, financial bubbles grow, and governments become increasingly dependent on borrowing. This is where the ideas of Giovanni Arrighi and Joseph Schumpeter become relevant. Arrighi described long cycles of accumulation in which productive expansion is eventually followed by financialization and systemic crisis. Schumpeter emphasized what he called creative destruction. The important point is that crisis does not necessarily mean the end of the system. It can become a mechanism through which old assets are destroyed, capital is reorganized, and new opportunities for accumulation emerge. And that brings us directly back to the present war. When supply chains are destroyed, markets become unstable, infrastructure is damaged, and economies fall into crisis, enormous amounts of wealth can be transferred. Those with liquidity can survive the collapse and purchase assets from those who are forced to sell. So when I ask who benefits and who pays, I am not talking only about governments. I am talking about ordinary people whose savings, homes, businesses, and jobs are exposed to the consequences of war, while those with enormous amounts of mobile capital can potentially move their wealth to safer markets and later acquire assets at heavily discounted prices. That is why I believe we have to look beyond the battlefield. The missiles and drones are only one part of the story. Underneath them is a financial system in which war, debt, destruction, and accumulation can become interconnected. Now we come to the question of who actually benefits from this process, and who pays the price. For ordinary people, war means instability. The American middle class has much of its wealth tied to retirement accounts, stocks, housing, and financial markets. When war disrupts supply chains and credit markets, those assets can lose value very quickly. Working people face higher prices, weaker purchasing power, unemployment, and the possibility of losing their savings. Small businesses are especially vulnerable because they depend on access to credit and short-term financing. When banks become more cautious during a crisis, businesses that normally survive on working capital can suddenly find themselves unable to operate. A financial crisis therefore becomes a real economic crisis for ordinary families. People who own factories, land, machinery, and other fixed assets face another problem. Their capital cannot simply be moved to another country when conditions deteriorate. They are tied to particular locations and therefore remain exposed to war, recession, and political instability. The government faces its own burden. Massive military spending increases public debt and interest costs, while resources that could have gone toward healthcare, social programs, or other domestic needs are redirected toward war. But those with enormous amounts of liquid capital have a very different position. Their wealth can be moved across borders and shifted between financial instruments and markets. When a crisis forces families, companies, or governments to sell assets at extremely low prices, those with liquidity can potentially step in and buy them.